why didn't the defense talk about why Karmelo had this knife? To our point, why did the defense allegedly say, and I read there were shocks and gasps from the gallery where the defense almost implied that Austin was the one that sort of made the knife go in. I mean, if that is true, that is so disturbing to listen to. If I'm Austin's parent in there, I mean, I'm getting kicked out of the courtroom, Mark.
Well, welcome to one angry man and one really angry woman. And subbing in today for Harvey Yacht Rock Levin is none other than Lauren Angry Conlin. Lauren, how are you today?
I'm not that angry today. Lucky for you, Mark. I have been a little angry this week. You've caught the brunt of it, but we're good. We're calm.
Okay. I'm not going to get into it. I'm not going to waste.
Please don't.
You have been the angriest. You would think, I don't know what, but you have been so angry at me this week.
I know. We won't get into it, but we're good. I'm not angry. I'm calm. I mean, I take it back.
By the way, this is your not angry persona. Okay, go on.
Yes, I am not angry. Well, listen, the aftermath of what we're about to speak about is making me a little angry, but nothing personal, of course. So we're good.
Okay. So what are we going to talk about today? As if I didn't know.
Yes, we are going to talk about the murder trial of Karmelo Anthony, and we're going to talk about the verdict, Mark, and we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, the aftermath. And the aftermath, I think, is definitely one of the most shocking aspects, or I guess not so shocking now that we're living in 2026 and people are basing all of their judgments on emotions and not evidence. That's my issue right now.
And the part of what we're talking about, if you don't know, is this is a 17-year-old African-American young man who was convicted within the last 72 hours of the charge of murder. And the victim and the deceased was also a 17-year-old white, one of two twins, but only one was stabbed on one stab wound at a high school track meet under a tent during a rain break, if you will, in which the testimony, at least in general terms, was that it was a tent for a high school, that it was a tent that was at a track meet, that the young man who is accused and now convicted of murder went into that tent, did not move when asked to move. There was words back and forth. I believe that most people would say that the deceased put hands on the accused, and whether it was a shove, whether it was push, it was characterized in both ways. And then the accused, now convicted, whose hand was in a backpack, who had said, basically, touch me and see, or something to that effect.
See what happens. Mm-hmm.
See what happens, reached in, 3.5-inch knife, plunged once, one stab wound, unfortunately fatal, into the heart, then left, was caught, and said when caught, then somebody said, I've got the alleged perpetrator, or something to that effect. He then responded, not alleged.
I did it. That's what he said. And Mark, I think what's also important to understand is you and I did a podcast previously, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, where we're discussing this. And it's important because, I'm just used to calling murder one. And when we referred to murder as murder one, in Texas, there's capital murder, manslaughter. There's no second degree murder. And I think that in every state, the premeditation element is also different. So I was looking at this, and again, I was not in the courtroom. I'm basing this off what I'm reading. Obviously my favorite reporter from Court TV, Cody Thomas. I'm basing it off what
he's going to be joining us shortly.
Yes, our favorite. So, what I'm thinking in my head is like, well, maybe this is manslaughter because he didn't know Austin Metcalf. I'm thinking it's going to be explained to us why he brings a knife to a track meet. Maybe he was beat up previously by other kids at another school. None of that came out. None of that happened. And the fact that a jury rejected a sudden passion plea, which again would cap his sentence at 20 years instead of 35 years, which is what he got, they rejected that. The jury thought he deliberately intended to kill. I mean, and that's that. And that blew my mind without, again, being in the courtroom, because, the defense painted Karmelo as a good kid, got above a 3.0 grade point average. He wasn't some thug. He participated in after school events. He worked 2 jobs. So I was shocked to hear that this was cold-blooded murder, and it broke my heart. I mean, it absolutely broke my heart. The Metcalf family, what they are dealing with now is disgusting. They are getting death threats. Why? I don't know. Why are they getting death threats, Mark?
In both directions, it has become incredibly heated. It's become incredibly polarizing. I think that not only in that direction, in the other direction, and it unfortunately is part of what happens in America in these kinds of cases. And it's just unfortunate. I think it would have been better. I've really evolved on this issue if there had been cameras in the courtroom.
Definitely. Without a doubt. Also, Mark, I think Karmelo should have taken the stand. The mugshot of him where he looks very scared, he looks nervous. And by the way, guys, I'm talking about this case objectively. Obviously, he is a convicted murderer and he took the life of another person. And, we don't tolerate that in this country, of course. But I just, putting him on the stand may have shown the jury that he didn't, intend to kill. I mean, his family is over here saying justice for Karmelo. They want, they're saying it wasn't fair. Well, I'm trying to figure out what wasn't fair. What's not fair about this?
I'll talk with Cody a little bit about that because he was in the courtroom, and we've heard so much about what happened in the courtroom. He was there. Unfortunately, cameras were not. Unfortunately, I don't think, and we'll ask him, I don't think there was a transcript or a daily transcript that was released, which at least would have been helpful. I mean, appellate courts all the time decide trials and or the appellate writes in a trial based on the transcript. And I don't think the public had that. One of the things I think was particularly irksome to me as somebody who does a fair share of murder trials and over the years is I think this idea of the binary, it was either murder or a not guilty. I don't think that there could have been a credible argument that he was not guilty of murder and not guilty of any crime, if you will, because the force that was used, and when you enter into an affirmative defense, which is self-defense, the force that's used matters. It's what is that force in reaction to? And so if it's a push or it's a shove, does that allow you to use potentially deadly force with a knife? And I don't think anybody is going to say if it's just a push or a shove. To your point, if he had taken the stand and had said, I thought they were going to jump me and beat the hell out of me, and I've had, to your point also, I have this framework or this has happened to me before or something like that, and they were over me and they were much bigger than me, and that's what was going through my mind, and it was a split-second reaction, and of course I didn't mean to kill him. I just did it. I kind of I reached out. Yes, I had my hand in the backpack, but it was no different than a cop who's got his hand on the gun and saying, "Don't move." I had my hand in the backpack, and I said, touch me and see what happens. I was trying to be a tough guy because I'm only 160 pounds and they were in excess of 200 pounds. That at least gives you an argument that you've used excessive force for the situation, which doesn't mean you're not guilty and walk out the door. It means it mitigates the murder to a manslaughter, to your point.
Right. And I think I think that what I have been thinking about also as you're talking, and I think you mentioned this the other day, the imperfect self-defense, where you have to take some kind of culpability here, which is what he should have done, especially because he already admitted to it. So that's number one. And then going back to what I said when, I heard his family on an interview saying it's not fair, this is not fair. I think it's a two-parter for me, right? I mean, you've got the lawyer that I believe, from what I have read, I wasn't there. He did not do a good job, in my opinion, for a number of reasons. And you may or may not agree. And then again, I put myself in the shoes of a defendant. If I'm, on trial for something and there is not one Caucasian person on the jury, I might feel a certain way, right? I might feel, okay, I'm a little uncomfortable here, but I guess I'll trust the lawyers and I'll trust the judge. So that is definitely going to be part of his appeal. I'm assuming.
Yeah, and that's a heavy lift, and I'll tell you why.
Oh.
The heavy lift part of the jury selection is the way that the law is written, at least as you see it in Texas. Might have been a different result in California, but because California's got what's called the Racial Justice Act, and there's certain that certain little you've got more tools in your toolbox. But in Texas, when the prosecutor is saying and being challenged for challenging a African American and is using the statement, "Oh, it's an educator. I didn't want an educator because an educator is going to be unduly sympathetic to whatever." You can always, if you've got brain cells that are operating and you can't figure out a way to justify without saying, "Yeah, of course I got rid of her because she was African American." You think I'm going to let an African American woman sit on a jury with an African American 17-year-old who is accused of killing a white kid? Are you crazy? I mean, absent some prosecutor who you give truth serum to, you're not going to get that.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I do think he has a shot with his appeal over ineffective counsel, perhaps. I mean,
That would, yeah,
yeah.
but
Okay.
there's what's called in the law a ineffective assistance of counsel, IAC. I'm not going to opine on that because I know that I've certainly seen cases where somebody, when it was not televised, and somebody thought that the defense lawyer did something in a courtroom, and I've read the transcript, and I know that didn't happen, and it became part of
Okay.
the legend. So I don't
Yeah.
know. We'll see, and we'll
But
get
like,
to that
don't
point.
you think it just goes back to, I have spoken to Cody numerous times throughout this past week, and he even said, he's like, I'm wondering as well.
Cody of Court TV.
Cody of Court TV, exactly, who's coming on soon. But he even said, why didn't the defense talk about why Karmelo had this knife? To our point, why did the defense allegedly say, and I read there were shocks and gasps from the gallery where the defense almost implied that Austin was the one that sort of made the knife go in. I mean, if that is true, that is so disturbing to listen to. If I'm Austin's parent in there, I mean, I'm getting kicked out of the courtroom, Mark, right then and there. I am getting kicked out. I'm sorry. So there is a lot of things, again, to your point, may or may not be accurate here, but a lot of things were shocking and very disturbing from the defense side.
Right. And that's, I guess, I don't want to make the whole episode, this is why you should have TVs in the courtroom, but obviously
Well,
right. But obviously this is a case, and we've seen many of them where the public has a real interest in it. And fortunately or unfortunately, there are real lives that are at stake and real lives that have been lost. And it I think would probably take down the temperature if you could actually see what was happening.
oh, I agree with you. And listen, we both know people who look at evidence and see the evidence in a completely different way than maybe you or I would. I have experienced this, but at least we have it. At least we have it in front of us to argue. That's all I'll say. I feel so horrible for the Metcalf family. I feel bad for Karmelo's family in terms of, they are losing their son, and he made a very, very, very poor decision that affected so many lives, and you can't take it back. So, what are people learning from this? I mean, I don't stab someone, don't bring a knife to a track meet. It's just, it's
Well,
tough.
I saw something today. I don't know if Branson's got it available, but obviously this has the race factor on both sides has now taken this to a new level.
Let me make one up. Y'all can let me make something racist up so y'all can go viral. I got a new name for Mello, okay? Because he was such this little boy y'all were trying to portray. How about watermelon felon? How's that one strike you? I hope he enjoyed his first night in that cell last night, because he's going to have many nights to think about what the he did.
Look, you give a pass to somebody who's lost their son, but that I don't think really moves the ball forward in terms of turning down the temperature.
Well, he said, I'm going to give you some. I mean, okay. I think from what I've also read, they're getting death threats. This guy's had it up to here. Not making excuses, though. I'm not making excuses.
No, I understand, and I know we live in an age where you have to frame everything and you have to be worried about the repercussions. But the fact remains that invokes and provokes, and at the same time, they've lost their son. They should be not getting death threats. He should not be reacting in this way. There's at the same time, the parents shouldn't be reacting that way, but I'm not going to scold people. But I think also if you had a little more transparency and a little bit more real-time coverage of this, we wouldn't be where we're at. Yeah.
I mean, again, parents that have lost children, and then on top of that, they're getting harassed, and his dad said it in I think his victim impact statement, stop making this about race. It's not about race. And I think he's saying that, just of course, from the perspective of sitting inside that courtroom, seeing all of the evidence, seeing kid after kid testify along the same lines of saying that Karmelo was the aggressor. Austin didn't want to fight him, even said, allegedly, I'm not going to fight you, bro. I mean, he's had it. He's had it. I don't think he should have said that, but he said it. And and here we are. So, Mark, we should bring in Cody, by the way.
Please, I'd love to. I really want to talk to him and see what he's got to say about this. There were very few, he'll tell us how many, but there were very few journalists who were actually allowed in the courtroom, is my understanding. And so that's also, I think, a problem, because then what's the pool for people who were in there? So straight from Court TV is Cody, as I mentioned, he may have mentioned, from Court TV, and straight from the state of Texas, covering a very gripping case, if you will. Cody, how are you? Welcome.
Doing great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, very gripping case nonetheless, very polarizing case across this country, caught a bunch of headlines, but I was in that courtroom, and I can tell you it was quite the emotional roller coaster on both sides.
So I have a question, since it was not televised, and Lauren, I'm sure, will jump in here, but there's been a lot, and when you say polarized, my friend Chris Cuomo had mentioned the other day, and I thought it was a spot-on observation, that it's almost a 100% accurate Rorschach test for where you are on the ideological or political spectrum. And I don't disagree with that. I have used that thought experiment with virtually everybody I know who I have known for years and know their political and ideological leanings, and it is spot on. If you found the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great analysis. I hadn't heard it put that way, but I couldn't think of a better way to put it. I mean, it was one of those cases, of course, you look at the optics here, and it's, just generally speaking, it's where the public either takes one side or the other, and it's almost like no one wants to see it down the middle. But of course, And that's where, the importance of public transparency comes in when it comes to these trials. I mean, people would love to have those cameras or at least audio recordings come out of the courtroom so the public isn't in the blind and only has to rely on 8 of us coming out to give our versions of what happened. And, you have to think about 9 hours a day with just a 40-minute lunch break and maybe a 10-minute afternoon break. You have each of us trying to condense 9 hours into these, 5 or 6 minute hits on television. So of course, naturally, some things are going to either be forgotten or things are going to be construed a different way just because of, it's like a game of telephone. You're taking in 19 witnesses and trying to put them in a 3-minute segment on television. So, that's public transparency is great, but we had to do what we had to do for this trial. And I think that's a great comparison to the Rorschach analogy there.
Yeah, and one of the things is when you have a case like this that reaches a certain level, I always call it the supersize case, where for whatever reason there's traction. There is, I think, it should almost be mandatory that there is televised, because we're never going to get to the British model where they just clamp down on it, clamp down coverage and eliminate coverage under contempt of court. So if that's going to be the case, rather than have people argue, and I've heard arguments that at least you seemingly are legitimate, and then ones are just so crazy that you don't even know how to engage with them. And you could settle it if you actually had. I don't even remember seeing daily transcripts posted on the internet. You had to rely on reporters, as you said, 1 of 8, doing their best to basically try to transcribe or dictate what it was, as opposed to just a cold transcript like an appellate court would get. And that is disconcerting to me.
Yeah, I mean, you got to think, Mark, we're sitting there, we're on our laptops, we're the only ones allowed in that courtroom with electronics. Other people couldn't even bring phones in. And then, this judge was laying down the law in that courtroom, making sure these electronic devices were only used for note taking. So we're sitting there trying to keep up like the court reporter with everything being said, following each witness that comes up, following the verbiage of what's being said in the best way we can, while trying to retain the information as well, thinking about our live shots or our newspaper rights later on. So it was this over-encompassing task, but of course we tried to do it to the best of our ability and get those facts out there as best we could.
And
sorry, I had a question. I had a very specific question I wanted to ask you, Cody, because I think this sort of made Karmelo Anthony's defense fall apart. And we talked about this. How many witnesses would you say testified that Austin Metcalf said, "I'm not going to fight you, bro"?
There was only a handful, Lauren. I don't remember the exact number, somewhere between like 4 and 6 of them.
Well, that's a lot, right?
That is a lot. And you got to remember the prosecution called 21 witnesses. The majority, I'd say probably 17 of them were, or 17 or 16 of them were student eyewitnesses. And then the defense only called 6 witnesses in their entire case, which I believe half of those were students. But on the prosecution side, naturally, every single last one said Karmelo was the instigator, was the aggressor. Well, some students did admit, these are 2 boys at a competitive track meet. Of course, there was some yapping back and forth, and they did admit that Austin was a little boisterous. But at the same time, they were talking about how Karmelo was stubborn, didn't want to leave the tent, talking about, "You're going to have to move me." And that's when a couple of those witnesses said, "Dude, I'm not going to fight you at a track meet. I'm not going to do this." And then, of course, it leads to the hand in the backpack, the touch me and see what happens, the whole incident that a lot of these students described as happening so fast that they didn't even realize what had happened. And a lot of them talked about how, you got to think, it's 2026 with a bunch of teenagers around, and not one single piece of video evidence from a cell phone was presented. That. Yeah, that's what I was expecting going in. Because, even back when I was in high school, as soon as you think something's building up, you're getting the phone. Oh, they're about to do it. They're about to whatever. And a lot of those students, all of them said they heard the boys yapping and saying whatever they were saying to each other, but not one of them felt nervous or concerned enough to where they thought a real fight was going to happen. Because it's just, again, testosterone, hormones, 17-year-old boys talking smack at each other. And then, of course, we know the horrific tragedy happened here that has changed both families' lives forever. Obviously, you have one child that's not coming back. One child is going to be behind bars for a very long time. 2 families that are affected it's like on the same scale, but on 2 different sides of the spectrum, right? So it's just a sad thing overall. But it's very interesting that not a single person talked about really Austin being the initial aggressor here.
Well,
Yeah.
there was a reason for that, I think, but let's talk about the bookends of this case because I think that's interesting. I've always taken the position that a trial, especially a trial like this, is won or lost in jury selection. It doesn't matter. I know that I get a lot of pushback for that, but when you've tried hundreds and hundreds of cases, I can tell you that it's a very rare case that once jury selection is over, that it's not preordained. I've told the story, people have heard it. George Zimmerman, there when it was an all-white jury that was selected, I remember going on CNN that evening and saying Mark O'Mara would have to trip, fall, and hit his head in order to lose this case. And in this case, and this will be, the comment section will go wild because we're at TMZ, but in this case, when there were three African American or blacks, and you were in the courtroom, you tell me, who were excused because supposedly they were educators, and that was the pretext, if you will, the explanation. Pretext has a pejorative sound to it, even though I mean it that way. But that was why they were excused. Well, once that happened, that preordained this case. Now, people will say, well, why are you injecting race? I'm not injecting race in that sense. And Cody, you tell me if I'm wrong based on what you watched. If you are going to hear a case, a court case, the lawyer's not going to change your mind about the way you've been raised in 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. It's going to be how you come into that courtroom and what your viewpoint is. And if you eliminate people who have a different experience, cultural and just societal angle, you've already skewed the playing field. Am I wrong? Did you see anything?
I mean, that was the whole crux of those headlines we saw once it was announced, and the public found out that there were no black people on that jury. Now the people in support of Karmelo were saying, well, this isn't really a jury of his peers because not everyone on that jury, no one on that jury has the shared experience of what it's like, growing up as an African American child or person in this country. So that was the whole crux of it. There was a little diversity on the jury. There was 3 Asian women and 2 what looked like to be Middle Eastern women. So it wasn't just an all-white jury, but of course,
By the way,
majority white.
can I tell you how many times? So when you make a peremptory challenge, that's what it is. You get to exercise defense and prosecution, even though I don't even think prosecutors who have the burden should be able to exercise them. But if you do, as a defense lawyer, there used to be a term, you can't use it anymore because it's politically incorrect. Defense lawyers were the one who got rid of Asians for the most part, and it was called the Orient Express, and that would be subject to a Batson challenge. Prosecutors would say, because prosecutors felt, and this went on for decades, that defense lawyers were getting rid of Asian jurors because Asian jurors, for the most part, the prejudgment was that they tilt pro-prosecution. So when somebody says, oh, it was still not all white, but it had an Asian component to it, that does not, for most defense lawyers, if they're going to tell the truth, they're going to tell you that is not an upgrade for a cross-section of the community that is not tilting towards the prosecution.
Yeah, and Mark, I mean, regardless of the makeup of the jury, right? The facts of this case were the facts, and it was almost as if from a defense standpoint, you had an uphill battle from the beginning, because one of the key things about this case, one of the exhibits that was presented, was that once after the stabbing happened and once he was apprehended on body cam, the woman radios in, "Hey, I have the alleged suspect," and then you hear Karmelo clear as day say, "I'm not alleged, I did it." I mean, you have an admission to doing this act, whether it was self-defense or murder or whatever at the time, right, when he got apprehended. But you still have him saying, "I did it," and that his actions ultimately led to somebody dying. So it was an uphill battle from the beginning. And I'll tell you, one of the most emotional parts of this trial, I've mentioned it on several different segments and platforms so far, was there was this one coach, Mark, that was a 14-year Iraq vet who has seen death before, right, and knows what the last breaths of someone sounds like versus just someone gasping for air. And so he was the one kind of doing chest compressions. He was a coach, and then there was another coach on 911. So the coach testifying, the veteran, was saying that, he's doing chest compressions and the kid's eyes are rolling back and he stops breathing, right? And so now the coach that's on the phone with 911 is talking about, oh, he's not breathing anymore, he's not breathing. And then all of a sudden you hear on the 911 call, we're listening to this in court, this coach says, oh, he's breathing again. Well, the veteran coach who was testifying, who has seen death and carnage and combat in Iraq and 3 tours in Iraq, said he knew those breaths that were coming were like the death rattle breaths. And he knew this kid was dying, but he said he didn't speak or say anything because he didn't want to kill the hope of the coaches and the students surrounding. So he just kept on doing chest compressions, whether, he knew they weren't going to work. And as he's testifying to this, he's getting emotional and crying. You're listening to this emotional 911 call. The Metcalfs are crying. And then I look up, and this is the only time I saw any real emotion from the jury. There were 2 or 3 of the men wiping their eyes with Kleenex. And of course, the women were tearing up too. And it was Mark, at that moment, I was like, I know this was the first day, I believe. This was Thursday when the testimony started. And I'm just sitting there thinking, maybe the majority of this jury, if not all of them, have made their decision right then and there. Because at the end of the day, facts are facts, but also there's a human component as well, an emotional component that we can't, these jurors are not robots. They're probably parents and everything else. And they're probably thinking about their families, how they would be affected if something like this happened. So that was the big takeaway from the trial as a whole to me. That was the most emotional moment for me personally. But of course, how this ultimately went out, guilty of murder, the intentional causing of harm that resulted in death, not the manslaughter charge, not the sudden passion, which the sudden passion thing only came up in the closing arguments before the sentencing, right? And I don't know why they would not have, as the defense, if you're going to argue sudden passion, why not try to harp on that from the beginning instead of trying to go for the home run acquittal when you have the kid on camera saying that he did it. Just an interesting case, but ultimately, ended up in 35 years behind bars, eligible for parole after half of that. So he's got quite some time behind that plexiglass, seeing his family from now on.
And a lot of people have asked, why is it, or how did they rush to sentencing? That is part of the Texas framework. In Texas, unlike other jurisdictions, a lot of other jurisdictions, the jury goes out virtually immediately and they deliberate on what the punishment should be. So that once again emphasizes the fact of what is a jury? It's the conscience of the community. And what is the conscience of the community? It's who do you have in the jury box? Given all of that, though, the one pushback I'd give is that if
I got one more question, time for one more, because I got to go do real television in a second.
I know.
Well, you have to go to Court TV?
Yeah,
I got to go to Court TV. I got to switch studios, man. I joined you for a little bit. I love to see your beautiful faces, but your boy has to run.
Court TV Cody. Court TV Cody. Lauren, ask the question.
Yeah, I love Cody. I was glued to Cody's coverage. So I just want to thank you, Cody. It really was helpful to listen to you. And I'm sorry you got heckled outside of the courtroom too. That's crazy. I mean, that's
the
very inappropriate.
nature of what's going on, nature of the business, it's that kind of deal. So, but we're here. But right now, folks, I got to go. And I love you a lot. Thanks for having me. Find me on Instagram, Cody Thomas _ all that good stuff. I'll be around.
Thank you, Cody.
All righty. I'll see y'all later.
Okay, that was too short, but unfortunately, you had to get back to the anchor desk. And what's your takeaway from that? Did you change your mind after hearing that?
No, I mean, everything he said, I had been following throughout the week, but I did see he actually sent me a screenshot of him on a live shot, and he was being heckled by a bunch of people in the back calling him a traitor. Just, because he's Black and he was reporting simply the facts and the evidence and he was getting heckled and he was being harassed. And I was just like, oh my goodness. Every aspect of this case, I think I've said it a million times. I hate it. And even talking about it, Mark, it's like you just get destroyed for being objective. Not taking sides, just simply looking at the evidence. I mean, from a human being perspective and from the perspective of a parent, I mean, I am gutted. I am not okay with sending a child to a track meet and getting a call that they have been stabbed to death. Ow. That grinds my gears and that upsets me on an emotional level. But again, when I am parsing through the evidence here and what was said in court, what not was said, I do look at it from a different lens, obviously, as do you.
Well, and I think there are obviously, and it's a cliche or a platitude that there are no winners here, but I think that if you take a look at the way this thing unfolded and the way it was, what's particularly frustrating is the legal explanations in terms of the understanding what self-defense is, what imperfect self-defense is, what is the kinds of legal analysis you have to do when the criminal justice system gets involved. And
Mhm.
the father of the young boy who was killed, he made some good points not in this interview, but in other interviews that I've listened to him about. Said it would have gone a long way to him
Yeah.
have had an apology. And that's kind of a
Wow.
restorative justice concept. And I know that you normally would not do that, but there are times when you just don't follow the rule book. There's nothing wrong with an apology or some outreach to
Mhm.
say, look, this was obviously nothing that anybody intended. We didn't have enough time to ask Cody, but reportedly there was testimony that in real time, the accused, now convicted, said he's not going to die, or didn't.
Or that he asked. I actually have the original police affidavit, excuse me, where he is in the back of a squad car and he asks, is he going to die? And, you know, I go back and forth because it's like, he's 17 years old. You're obviously not an adult. Your brain isn't fully formed, but you know better. You have to think about the consequences of your actions. If you stab someone, there is a chance they are going to die. And that's that. And Mark, I also want to point out, going back to just, state murder charges and just, state laws in general, I just started thinking about like the Luigi Mangione case. Luigi in New York is charged by the state second-degree murder only. The minimum for that is actually 15 years. So if you think about this state by state here, I mean, it's kind of wild. I have to say.
Well, I'll leave it at that. That's probably on a note where we can leave it. And Lauren, thank you for being an angry woman today,
No problem.
transitioning two angry men to one angry man and one angry woman. And maybe we'll see you next week. You never know, because Harvey is constantly on a yacht somewhere, living that first world life that we all aspire to.
Oh man, I love it. Well, I'll be around whenever you need me, and I'm praying for the Metcalf family that they have peace, in losing their son. So,
Yeah,
want to leave it at that.
nobody wants to be in their position.
No.
Thanks, Lauren.